This KFAN podcast is sponsored by Builders and Remodelers, exclusive Twin Cities provider of Elements Windows. Get the highest quality windows at unmatchable value. Visit buildersandremodelers.com for more details.
This is your What Was Your Favorite Liberals of Minneapolis moment. Leader Fan Radio Network.
Okay.
And KFAN.com. 2 minutes and 34 seconds past the hour, 3 o'clock Central Daylight Saving Time. We welcome you back to a Tuesday edition of the Bumper to Bumper program on this fine, if slightly, yet again, moist weekday afternoon in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. My name is Dan Barreiro. I am the overheated host of the program. Guardsy produces the show. And it's a 3-hour tour today. Chad Abbott, the program director, reminded us this morning. We are out at 6 for yet another, I think it's the 12th straight time the Lynx and Liberty have played. Or actually, technically, this is, I think, the last time we're going to meet them.
Yeah.
Until the postseason rematch, if the Liberty gets there. We're going to get there.
We're already there.
We know that.
We've clinched.
Well, we haven't clinched making to the finals, though, necessarily, but we have clinched getting into the postseason. The Liberty obviously will make the postseason out of the vaunted Eastern Conference, but the Lynx are in very good position there. So we're out at 6 for, is this a home or a road game?
This is in New York.
This is in, I guess that makes sense. New York, starring, of course, the commissioner. You want to go ahead and get the dress joke out of the way early?
No, I'll wait. I'll wait. I'm going to hold that one for a little while. Yeah.
In your back pocket, as we like to say in the business.
But she's pulling hard, given that the Lynx have pretty much dominated this series lately. It doesn't sound like Stewart's going to play again, but did practice yesterday, apparently.
Is she ever cut? So they must they're trying to be very conservative with her to be sure she's ready for the postseason.
I guess. I would assume so,
So
yeah.
is Nafisa Collier going to get back quicker?
Yes, I would think so. Because she was already listed yesterday, was it? Or Friday. As doubtful. So I haven't seen the designation for today.
Okay.
On whether or not she's coming back.
Fair enough. We have an outstanding array of eclectic guests today. One came together very late. His flexibility is always admirable for us. Because in the case of Gerald Posner, I noticed that, he's rightly feeling pretty good about himself right now. He scooped the vaunted, except to you, Maury Amsterdam guy, I get it, New York Times regarding the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, in utter and complete disarray. Great story via his Substack column. And then Posner hit a couple of other notes today that interested me. So we're going to catch up with him at last-minute fashion, beginning at 3:30, because he is making the allowances in his schedule to join us. So that's coming up at 3:30 this afternoon. In addition, Kevin Seifert is scheduled for some time, it appears, late in the 4. Is that the best guess?
I'd say it tentatively 4:30 at the moment, and if we need to make an adjustment,
might be 4:45.
We'll go 4:45.
All right, fair enough. Vikings training camp is ongoing. A lot to catch up with Seifert, because we've not talked to him since the last preseason game. There's some interesting ESPN copy to discuss regarding the Vikings as well that's getting some attention. So Seifert, sometime late, 4:30 or a little bit later, in the 4 o'clock hour of today's broadcast, and a very special in-studio guest. He's back in studio, Andy Luger, former U.S. attorney. And in this case, again, I'm hoping to explore a number of subjects with him, but the primary one was him listening to our conversation regarding the Dan Wetzel ESPN investigative piece regarding sextortion cases, in which young, usually high school-aged, American male athletes, in this case, basically being sextorted. And the ramifications of that trend, the tragedy of that trend. And there's another piece of this story that Andy Luger says is one we also should be talking about, and that has great relevance to not just the entire country generally, but the state of Minnesota in particular. So he will be in studio in the 5 o'clock hour of the broadcast as well. Speaking of Maury Amsterdam guy, he just texted, listening to my open, in fairness, liberals of Minneapolis could be considered redundant. Not so fast, Maury Amsterdam guy, because that's what I want to talk about today. I think liberals in the traditional form of that definition, sort of standard stock and trade, historical liberals that would go back all the way to the 1960s, I'm beginning to think they are dead in the city of Minneapolis. I think we're close to that, because I would suggest, for example, that the current mayor of Minneapolis is a classic liberal. Now, I think he goes to the P word, progressive party, in some areas, the progressive side of the Democratic Party. But I would still say he's more of a classic liberal. And it's becoming increasingly clear with each day that he has no chance. And let me quickly remind you, this doesn't mean that Jacob Frey is above criticism, or that that should give him a certain measure of standing that means he's, you can't ever push back on him. But we have a story that's just broken in the last several hours regarding another Minneapolis City Council member. In fact, this one, for the record, is the council vice president. She represents Ward 10, which is, I believe, in the central part of the city of Minneapolis. And according to several media outlets, she appeared appeared in SPI Fest, which is, I guess, an uptown music festival. Now, I don't know, was this over the weekend? I'm not sure if I'm clear on what day this took place. But she apparently made a brief onstage appearance at the Green Room during the festival. And she spoke into a microphone, or somebody captured the audio. And among the things she said was, "We are going to transform this city." She's kind of yelling it. At which point she says, "Bleep Jacob Frey, bleep fascism, and bleep Donald Trump." Now, she, I'm sure, is going to try to say, well, I just named two individuals and one concept. I didn't say Jacob Frey was a fascist. But what can't be denied is, even if that's where she tries to excuse the inexcusable, Aisha Chugtai, in a position, like I said, of authority in a public forum, decides that to get her point across, it's going to be bleep Jacob Frey. Why is that? Is it because she doesn't like Jacob Frey's policies? No, it's because she doesn't think Jacob Frey is progressive enough. This is the trend in the city of Minneapolis. Let's not run from it. Let's not hide from it. If you check the city council, the trend in the city council has nothing to do with what might be classified as traditional liberal politics or values. Nothing. It is so far to the left of that, it's even, I think, at some point, difficult to quantify. Now, I've said this before. I think you and I have talked about this, Guardsy. I am not, I don't believe, even when we have violence, and we had some horrible violence here not that long ago, I don't think that you can then tell people they can't criticize tough, harshly, that suddenly, like Gopher football a long time ago, politics ain't croquet, baby. I understand that. I'm not saying that everybody has to be polite. But you tell me what kind of message this sends to her fans and to her detractors and her opponents in 2025. What is politically mature, even adult, about, especially given her a position of authority within the city council, of giving, I guess, exactly what the audience wanted. What does that do? What does that say? Well, again, a lot of people are shocked. I actually applaud her to the extent that I'd rather her be honest. I'd rather her not hide behind the platitudes. If this is how she really feels, then you kind of know what you're dealing with. And to the liberals of the classic liberals of Minneapolis, this is what you're dealing with now. This is your city. Are you fine abdicating to this wing of the party? So ultimately, it's your decision. People who vote in various wards, it's your decision. But better that it gets out, I think, in all honesty. She'll probably do the Sirwanga. Maybe she won't. Maybe it doesn't even matter. But to me, this helps further emphasize and crystallize what we kind of already knew. Classic liberals in Minneapolis are dead. They are losing their currency. This is the future of the party, at least the way people are voting and the way individuals like this woman are speaking. The kind of rhetoric that we rightly hammer, mock, ridicule when it comes from Republicans, when it comes from the Oval Office. Can't be any different just because it's a lefty who said it. It can't be any different just because it's a far lefty who said it. There is reaction from other members of the city council. We'll get to a little bit of that, get to some texts, and then prepare, as I mentioned, for Gerald Posner about it.
Life moves fast. A new home, a new baby, a new chapter. But without an estate plan, your future's still vulnerable. With Trust and Will, you can name guardians, start a trust, create healthcare directives, and more. All online in about an hour. It's attorney-designed, state-specific, and built to protect what you love. Plans start at just $199, and every plan is safe, secure, and kept completely private. From families with young kids to adults caring for aging parents, Trust and Will makes it simple to take control, without a law office, paperwork stress, or court delays. Go to trustandwill.com and use code RADIO to save 20%. Start your plan today. Don't wait for life to force your hand. Estate planning is one of the smartest, most loving things you can do. Trust and Will is an online estate planning service. See website for details.
Trust and Will.
The hour.
Get ready to laugh out loud. Gabriel Iglesias is bringing his comedy tour to Treasure Island Resort and Casino live September 6th and 7th. Don't miss your chance to see one of the world's funniest comedians. Tickets today are available at TICasino.com.
Council members Linnea Palmisano, Andrea Jenkins, and Michael Rainville issued a statement calling Chugtai's behavior an extraordinary breach of decorum, saying she should apologize to the mayor, her council colleagues, and residents of Minneapolis. Here's the statement. In our time in the city council, we've never seen a council member, much less council leadership, use such inflammatory and disrespectful rhetoric toward a sitting mayor. This is the kind of behavior from the council majority and council leadership that has made it even harder to work through our disagreements for the good of the city. She has no interest. She's a torch everything rhetorical person. She does not want to play fair. She does not want to negotiate. She doesn't really want any of that. That's why I say I actually applaud the honesty, as tough as it is to listen to. 701 guy, the kindler, gentler Minnesota politics post Melissa Hortman didn't last long, did it? No, it did not. And we predicted it 3 days later that it wouldn't last. It never lasts. And technically speaking, is what she said a call to violence? No. But it's why I didn't really want to, I rolled my eyes at all the platitudes and all those statements of we have to think a little harder before we go down these rhetorical lanes we do. Don't insult us. You're not going to. And we were already seeing plenty of evidence of exactly that. For what it's worth, Chugtai did not secure the DFL endorsement for re-election to the 10th Ward City Council rep. Let me get a text from a guy who identifies himself as hard lefty. This is Paul in St. Louis Park. I wondered if you might go here, Dan, but I didn't expect you to open with it. I am a hard lefty, very progressive, but I will throw out that the Minneapolis City Council is utterly dysfunctional and is not serving my native city, which I love well or even at all. I'm furious with this, and I'm furious with all of it. They're not serving the public. They're serving a rhetorical agenda. Performative politics, I think, is what we call it, and that's, I think, a lot of what this is. 612 guy says, I need to calm down. Fry won comfortably last time. He'll probably win comfortably again. He's much more popular than the council, which is kind of a mess. I'm trying to understand how these individuals get elected. Because if they get elected because this is the will of the people, then that's what we have to come to grips with and stop being outraged by or wondering, well, how did we get here? Somebody's voting for these individuals. Now, if it's simply a matter of not enough people vote,
that's probably part
period
of it.
in these elections, then that's another conversation that at some point we can indeed have. From what I understand, the only city in the country more progressive than Minneapolis is San Francisco, and San Francisco is a mess. Just another rural Minnesotan from the outside looking in. The Metro and its reputation couldn't be more in the cellar. It's unfortunate that our state and all our beauty gets demolished because of a 0.0006% sliver of land known as Minneapolis. I'm not going to go that far, 701 guy. I will tell you, frankly, that, and not a lot of people want to hear it when we talk about this. I believe in cities. I believe in the importance of cities. I would like to see the city better run. Not going to lie to you on that. But I'm not dismissive of it, what it represents, what it can represent at its best, what it gives a state. And that's not an anti-rural rant either. It's saying there's, there should be a place for everything. So for the people who just want to dismiss out of hand anything or everything that happens in the city of Minneapolis, and let's be honest, many of the people who do that haven't been in the city of Minneapolis in 20 years. And they hear what they hear. And that doesn't mean there aren't problems. We've talked about that problems. We've attempted to explore them. We have not run from them at all. But a lot of the people, and they know who they are, it wouldn't matter. In other words, Minneapolis could have a stretch of literally zero crime for 2 months, and then one thing would happen, and the individual would say, see, that's why I don't go near Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Can't get near there. I can't get even in the same, any of the same zip codes that might be involved with it. So, in any case, that's where we are with this particular story. And again, is it maybe this is an example of, well, this is a louder voice, but not necessarily a voice that represents that much of the city. Maybe Fry will win again. And again, I'm not endorsing anybody for this job. I don't think Fry is above criticism by any stretch of the imagination. How long has he been in the job? You could even make the argument, the old deal of maybe it's time for somebody else. But as I mentioned, the battles that have ensued, especially the last year or two, it seems, between the city council and the mayor, have told me everything about the direction, certainly of the city council. So you can say, well, he'll still win as mayor, and that might well be true. But he has now found himself in a position where he's viewed as like he's a crackpot conservative by much of the city council. And that's delusional. You can have disagreements about policy, and we have we talk about misinformation all the time. How much misinformation was that about that big bust? The notion that the city was cooperating with the federal authorities. I think it's been fairly well established, even by a report afterwards, investigation, that basically what the city did at the last minute was attempt to keep the peace at that location. Correct? Has that mattered? Not according to some of the rhetoric you get out of the city council, where the decision was made before we knew anything about what kind of cooperation might have taken place. We're going to come down on the city. They're cooperating too much. They're part of the fascist problem. So again, even if he's mayor, how effective can he be where the battles are whether the policies are progressive enough, not whether the policies, we might be able to implement policies that could help this city where it needs to be helped. It's, I'm not being held back by the right. There is no right in Minneapolis. There's no right side of the political aisle. I'm being held back by the far left. So I think it still matters, even if he wins comfortably. It still says something to me about the fact that the liberals are losing the city and the progressives are and socialists, let's be clear about this, are 100% absolutely gaining. And I'm not even sure we know the half of it, to tell you the truth. Bradshaw and Bryan KFAN text line is open at 646-86. 646-86. And I'll save some of the text. We'll be able to get back to it a little bit later as well. I have no doubt, although it's a busy show over the next 3 hours, including, as I mentioned, Kevin Seifert, latest Vikings steam between 4:30 and 5 o'clock today. Andy Luger in studio on other subjects. Maybe we can get into some of this, too, because he has strong feelings about rhetoric issues. I know that's one of the things we talked about last time he was in the chair here. But when we come back, Gerald Posner on whether right before our eyes, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is imploding in a way that we are only beginning to fully grasp and understand.
Life moves fast. A new home, a new baby, a new chapter. But without an estate plan, your future's still vulnerable. With Trust and Will, you can name guardians, start a trust, create healthcare directives, and more. All online in about an hour. It's attorney-designed, state-specific, and built to protect what you love. Plans start at just $199, and every plan is safe, secure, and kept completely private. From families with young kids to adults caring for aging parents, Trust and Will makes it simple to take control, without a law office, paperwork stress, or court delays. Go to trustandwill.com and use code RADIO to save 20%. Start your plan today. Don't wait for life to force your hand. Estate planning is one of the smartest, most loving things you can do. Trust and Will is an online estate planning service. See website for details.
Trust and Will.
Guardsy, what did I mention? Was it either yesterday or it might have been late last week? But the latest New York Times, especially online circulation numbers.
Through the roof.
Through the roof. They are a machine that seems to defy the logic that major, media players are dying off in the current age, like so many, sadly, newspapers are. So how amazing is it when one individual with one Substack column can take on all that New York Times heft and infrastructure, right? Safety in huge numbers. Reporters who've been, when they make a phone call, it's like, I'm so-and-so, New York Times. And yet in this case, our next guest took on that monstrosity and won. How did he do this? He scooped the New York Times on what appears to be the early signs of an utter and complete IRS implosion.
To answer your question, I would say it's amazing, but in this case, not surprising because of who the individual is.
Very, very true, Davey. Gerald Posner, kind enough to join us via the Connecticut Water Systems hotline. Now, I'm assuming you still have some people at the Times. Are you a taunter? Are you someone who at a time like this, you make those calls and say, hey, about time you guys figured it out. You caught up. Good for you.
Yeah, that would be so fantastic. I've never been a taunter, and I'm certainly not with the Times because I still occasionally bother them by sending over a piece or a possible op-ed.
Good point.
And the great thing is about this, Dan, is that I scooped them, but without knowing that I was in a race.
Yes.
So what happens is, as a reporter, often somebody gives you. I was actually thinking of reworking this and possibly submitting it to, maybe it would go to Forbes or something like this. And then one of the people that I'd interviewed called me up and said, by the way, last week we were talking to a couple of Times reporters. They're doing a story on this. And I said, really? And then I got it out in the Substack on Saturday. And then a few hours later, the Times ran their story. You hate to follow the Times because, it looks like all you've done is picked up the news story there and then,
aggregate
done some piece on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let me read the headline on your Substack piece. The IRS is imploding. Subhead, 7 commissioners, 25,000 staff gone, an 800-page overhaul. If you pay taxes, you are in the blast zone. Before we kind of break this down, drill down, get more specific, what made you go down this road in the first place? Were there sources who said, hey, something's up? How did you even begin to explore this particular story?
Yeah, so I am admittedly a nerd, and I get all types of documents and subscriptions to things that people would otherwise say, well, why would you want to even read that stuff? And one of the things I get is a thing called Kiplinger's tax letter. I think it's a very small group of people. It probably just goes out to accountants and things like that, but I love the way that they sort of give you a heads up on things that are taking place. And this is a paper newsletter that goes out the old-fashioned way, and you sort of get it. And they were saying a few months ago, boy, there's chaos inside the IRS, but few people are talking about it. They don't really do investigative work. They just sort of, say that for the purpose of the accountants. And we know it by how long the lines are getting, how long the telephone is, that there are fewer people to answer material, and there seems to be nobody who's fresh on the new tax codes. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? Maybe there's a story there. So I started to reach out to people that I had known before in the Justice Department who had done white-collar criminal work, including tax prosecutions. And they said, those days are gone. Nobody's going to get prosecuted for white-collar tax crimes anymore because all the money's gone and the staff is down in half. I said, great. Tell me some people to call, and that started the process.
So let's get, first of all, I guess we should talk about the impact the leadership changes have. Is that where this begins? We're going to get to the number of employees, 25,000 expected to leave by September 30. But give the folks who maybe haven't been paying attention very closely to this story sort of a history of the number of leadership changes that have been made and why they have been made as often as they have since Trump took office the second time.
Yeah, it's interesting because you need some leadership. You need a steady hand at the head of any of these federal agencies. That sets the tone. The bureaucrats underneath have been there for a long time, but you need the person who's the commissioner who says, this is how we're running it and doing it. And you had when President Trump first came in, there was a career public servant who had been under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and he left not long after. And then it started to what I call real musical chairs. So the next guy in was a fellow who had been there for 35 years, took over as commissioner. He lasted a little over a month. They're playing hardball in there, and that was followed by a woman, Melanie Krause, who resisted sharing taxpayer information with ICE. So she was out. Elon Musk was still then running Doge. He had a lot of influence, and he liked this guy, Gary Shapley, who was a former IRS criminal investigator. Shapley got in there, and Scott Bessent, who's the Treasury Secretary, who normally has control over what happens at the IRS, was furious that he wasn't asked for the final approval. So Shapley, Musk's appointment lasted literally 48 hours. That's the shortest of the group. So now we're in total chaos. And then comes a guy, Michael Falklander, who tried to stabilize the situation. He's sort of the Deputy Treasury Secretary and the acting IRS Commissioner. He goes, and in comes Billy Long, who's the former Missouri congressman. He gets approved by Congress to be the commissioner. So we say, sort of breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, you've got a commissioner who's going to put things in order and get things stable. And then a week ago, Donald Trump says, you're out. You're going to become the ambassador to Iceland. And right now, Bessent's running it. So it's been a little chaotic at the top, to say the least.
So the number you have in this piece is that upwards of 25,000 employees, about almost a quarter of the workforce, are expected to leave by September 30. A lot of this accelerated by a voluntary deferred resignation program, targeted layoffs. How much of this is also Doge related?
So DOGE-related is a smaller part of it. When I say targeted layoffs, yes, some of it is about 20% is coming from what I call layoffs, the DOGE reductions. Most of it's coming from the voluntary deferred resignation. Now, who's taking those? The people who've been there the longest, who are closer to retirement, who can cash out. They're not looking at putting another 20 years in. So you're losing the people who have sort of the best institutional knowledge in that sense, the ones who actually understand what's going on. You're also losing people at the lowest end of the spectrum, like 8,000 to 9,000, what I call customer service representatives. Right. They're not going to be around, the ones who answer the calls or things like that. But some of the departments that are getting cut are the ones that bother me. When I see, for instance, like they call it the Large Business and International Division, that over half of its revenue agents, the most experienced ones, are gone. That's the one that audits corporations that have more than $10 million in assets. The criminal investigations, the ones where I got a tip before from my DOJ guy, they go after tax frauds and money laundering, all that stuff. They're down about 50%. And even the Office of the Chief Counsel, the sort of, has all the senior attorneys are down like 40%. That just means that people who aren't doing the right thing in companies that aren't paying everything they need to pay are going to get away with more crap as we go along because they don't have the enforcement arms. Now, that being said, I have to tell you, this is the first piece I think I've ever written. I was laughing the other day with my wife about this, Tricia, that I've written in which I sort of was waving this warning flag of saying, hey, chaos inside a federal agency, and it's not going to be working well, and it's got fundamental problems. And a lot of the feedback I got in direct messages and emails said, congratulations, that's the best news I've heard. I hate the IRS. Oh my God, they're such a fascist organization. They're like the Gestapo. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that they've just been torn asunder of that. What great news. That was not necessarily what I expected, nor why I was writing the piece.
Yeah, it's never been a particularly popular agency with people, but that doesn't mean that the average rube isn't going to be affected here. As you also write, the Telephone Assistance Division, which often that's the first opportunity, where the first point of contact for taxpayers, that's been pretty much wiped out, right? Over, 9,000 customer service reps have been let go or reassigned?
Yeah, right. And so not only means longer wait times, but it means the people being hired straight out of college, this would be bad enough if this was all happening on any given year, but it happens to be happening in the wake of the big beautiful bill, which I understand is supposed to make things simpler, but in terms of taxes, it makes it more difficult. So it doesn't do any simplification. It actually adds in 100 different provisions that make it quite more complicated, different aspects. And I've talked to accountants on this and tax attorneys. The problem is that the IRS normally does these massive documents for the professional to say, here's our guidance, here's how to interpret it, here's what it means, here's how you apply it to partnerships and LLPs, and here's what the deductions do. They aren't generating any of that material. They've already pushed off the start of the 2026 tax season to next February, which is late historically by them, the latest like in 40 years. They haven't come up with any of the guidance documents. They aren't training the new staff on what the new bill means. So I expect a fair amount of confusion over those new provisions, and you're going to see that play out over time as taxpayers get hit for an assessment, or they don't, and somebody else does, and then they fight it in court.
I've got several texts from people saying to both of us, not so fast, my friend, because they're insisting that that in the Biden years, there were huge increases in the number of individuals, agents hired. And so they are wanting to dismiss a lot of this as, well, We're just trying to get back to where we were. And so these numbers sound more ominous than they really are. To which you say what? Yeah.
No, I get that. And as a matter of fact, I talk about that in the piece. So in the Biden administration, in the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, right? Put that in quotes. They had put $80 billion aside for IRS modernization. Okay? $15 billion of that's earmarked for technology upgrades. All of that's on hold. So that money, which was supposed to be there, it's not as though it's being spent. It's not like they've spent $15 and $20 billion. Now we're going to roll it back. Those plans are completely in jeopardy. DOGE, as a matter of fact, has put all of the technology upgrades on hold under a comprehensive strategic review. And that's going to take about 6 months. Let me tell you, the technology is the worst part of the IRS. This has nothing to do with the Trump administration or the Biden administration. They're still using an old code that is hard to find programmers for anymore, COBOL. The machines don't talk to each other. They have trouble with fraudulent returns. They can't update the enhanced security measures. So that's a problem. In addition, the House Appropriations Committee has a proposal for next year's funding to reduce the IRS's budget from $12.3 billion, which it would be at, to 25% cut down to like $9 billion. That would be the biggest in IRS history. So no matter which way you look at it, yes, the Biden administration was going to add in all these additional enforcement officials and audit people. Everybody was up in arms. I didn't like that as well. I complain every April when I'm paying taxes. So I've done that for years. I don't have a love-hate relationship with the IRS. I have a hate relationship with them. Everybody does who pays taxes and does it the honest way. But in the end, I also understand that they are collecting the money on which the government runs, $5 trillion. And if we become a country, this is my feeling about this, that if we become like Greece or Argentina or Italy, and I'm half Italian, I'm sorry to insult Argentinians or Greeks or anybody else, but a tax system in which they admittedly do not collect 20 to 30% of the income that's generated in those countries because people just cheat and there's corruption and incompetence. If people feel here that rich, the elite, the top 0.1%, the big corporations are getting away with it because the IRS doesn't have the tools to be able to bring them in, they're not going to want to pay their fair share. I just think that it snowballs, so it's potentially a real problem.
And that, I think, that's the headline, right? I think you've distilled it to the essence of the story right there, even for people who want to go, yeah, I never liked those guys, and there's too much fat, etc. What you just laid out is the comeback, and there is no answer to it, I don't believe. Now, I saw a CNN story today in which they note that 7,300 or more probationary IRS employees were fired in February with a termination letter stating, taking into account your performance, your continued employment is not in the public interest. And a new IG report finds that 51% of those newer probationary employees didn't even have a performance evaluation on record yet. And for the other employees who had been evaluated, some 99% in that group, or I should say 99% of those were deemed fairly successful at their jobs or better. So the suggestion here is that whatever you think of DOGE and what it was attempting to do, we're going to end up paying more money because now we're on the brink of potentially a slew of lawsuits. What do you know about this?
Yeah, I do think you're right. I mean, there will be lawsuits that will come back from that without any doubt. Whether since they're probationary employees, even if they had though good initial performance, protocols, and some didn't have them at all. The government has very wide leeway to dismiss usually those probationary employees, and that's why DOGE went after the probationary employees time and time again. Now the lawsuits have tried to tie them up. I'll be surprised in some ways if in the end courts don't ultimately hold, especially if they get up to the Supreme Court, that the federal government has wide powers when it comes to dismissing probationary employees, even those who look like they might be promising long-term employees.
All right, stay tuned on this story. I highly recommend this particular, all of Gerald's work, obviously, but this is the piece that we've been talking about today that dropped. Was it Sunday, you said? Saturday or Sunday over the weekend?
Saturday,
related to the IRS stuff. Folks can get that very easily. Remind folks where it's Substack, basically, right? Are there other ways?
It's Substack. I have a Substack called Just the Facts with Gerald Posner. It's no charge. I don't monetize my Substack, so it's available for anyone that just wants to be able to look at an article or look at any of the other articles that are in the archive there. Far
afield from this story, you noted earlier today via your X account that you're thinking about an American journalist named James Foley. This is the 11-year anniversary of when he was beheaded by an ISIS terrorist. For the folks, again, maybe the younger folks in the audience, who was James Foley?
James Foley was an American journalist who had gone over and had covered the Middle East before after 9/11. Was well versed in Middle East politics and coverage. He knew the lay of the land, and he wasn't somebody who just went in and said, "By the way, I want to talk to dangerous people and let me do an interview." And he fell afoul of ISIS and the terror groups. This was somebody who still, notwithstanding all that knowledge and not having, and even though he had bodyguards, and even though you go out with a handler and somebody who is the translator and the contact for the extremists, and you're trying to get in there and get information about what they're doing, and you want to interview the ISIS people, he's held captive, and he becomes one of those who is beheaded in a gruesome public video at a time when the caliphate and ISIS is doing just that. It's one of the things that I think finally made the West and the Obama administration and others decide that it was time to stop them, was these gruesome public executions, including not just journalists died, but you sort of think that the journalists will somehow be protected, but nobody was protected against ISIS.
You reported in Afghanistan, I believe, 2011. That's another point you make in your X entry regarding this anniversary, and you mentioned that you at the time, you feel safe. Is it because you really were safe, or is it because you almost have to lie to yourself a little bit, or convince yourself, otherwise you're just not even going to get into those places to do the kind of reporting you're attempting to do?
Yeah, I think that, I consider myself that I was safe, but I'm sure that Foley thought he was safe, and the Wall Street Journal journalist who only 4 months after 9/11, Danny Pearl, who was working for the Journal and went to Karachi, knew that lay of the land very well to meet with an Islamic scholar, and his people who were setting up that meeting, who he thought were trustworthy, misled him, and he ended up being held in a series of videos with a gun to his head and everything else until he was beheaded. So you can't do this work as a journalist in any area where there is Islamists like that who are operating, and you're trying to cover them or write something about it, unless that's not in your mind. If it's in the front of your mind, you can't do your work. And so you clearly set it up so that you're convinced you're safe, and we are safe. Most of the journalists who cover that and go into the portion of the world, and I was there where the Taliban were around, you come out all right. But then I always say, and I've talked to other journalists about this who have been there, it just takes that one wrong step. It takes that one meeting too far, and once that happens, it's always the risk, but it's not what we think of. Nobody can think about that and still do the work. But it is sometimes, like today, it was the anniversary of Foley's,
yes,
and it reminds me of all of that, because for any of us who have ever covered any part of that world, those were among the most terrible deaths, because not that one death's worse than another, but that hit the profession.
Yeah, the Daniel Pearl story, as I recall it, was covered very heavily at the time, correct? His kidnapping and ultimately his beheading as well. Right. That was a massive story at the time.
But listen, it was covered heavily, but you know what most people don't know is that 4 years ago, a Pakistani court released the 4 men who had been accused of murdering Pearl. The 4 of them, the mastermind and the 3 accomplices, there was a ruling that acquitted the men. And the Pearl family was in uproar. It made the news at the time. They walked free, and they weren't caught for years afterwards. They had done another series of other terrors in between, and then when they're finally caught and arrested and put away for the killing of Danny Pearl, they're let out in 2021, and that was lost in all the COVID madness. We were all worried about COVID at the time, and that became a footnote story. Infuriating.
A quick item on, I see there's some information about the possibility of some more Epstein files being released at some point. One of the oversight committees chairman, I think, is saying that. Now, we've heard that before. I don't know how much time you've been spending on that story lately. Anything you can update on us there about where we're headed?
Yeah, I think there are. I've heard that as well today, that more Epstein files are coming out. But look, the way that this works, and you know it, once everybody focuses on one group of documents, and now it's on Epstein, it's a slow bleed for the government. You release more, and then people say, well, that's good. There were 79 files. What about the other 31? And then you release 28 of those. What about the last 3? So they're going to continue, the federal government's going to continue the Trump administration to be pressured until they get out just about everything. They've put themselves into a box on this in some ways. And I think that, there are Trump supporters that want it. There are people on the left in the Democratic Party that are using it as a weapon against him. And they, whether they want it or not, they're demanding it. I think it will continue to be an issue.
What can you tell us? What kind of analysis can you give, or how much time have you spent on what's going on regarding this debate about crime in Washington? Because again, it gets, it ends up being a sharks and jets political story pretty quickly. What was interesting to me about it was I think Axios today had a brief story indicating that the statistics regarding arrests thus far, and we can talk about, the fairness in approach, especially with masks on, that's maybe another story for another day, but that the number, one of the criticisms was, well, most of the arrests aren't in trouble crime areas of Washington. And I believe the Axios story said the stats that have just been released tell a different story, that in fact, at least 50 or 55% of those arrests have taken place in relatively heavy crime areas. So what do you make of this whole story that's obviously become so politicized so quickly?
Yeah, so I actually I used to be in D.C. a lot. We used to go there all the time. I used to felt like I lived in the National Archives for some of the books that I used to do. Trish and I would be there. We'd take extended breaks if we were early for a train at Union Station, all the things you can't do anymore. And I absolutely am convinced that separate from what's getting done on the ground with the federal troops moving in, that the crime statistics that showed the reduction had been gamed at the very least. And today, the U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro for that D.C. district announced a criminal investigation that DOJ is going to do to whether the police gamed those numbers. We already had one police commander who was suspended for having done that. And look at what happens, and it happens in other cities as well, is things that would otherwise be felonies, like assaults in which people are beaten, they're hit with sticks. There's a battery cam that's used against somebody. All of that, they all get down to misdemeanors in D.C. because the police don't consider it a felony to list unless it involves a gun. People stop calling in some of the lower crimes, like property crimes and items like that. The police put together, if they respond to a carjacking, there are 3 carjackings in a given neighborhood, they put them down as 1 for that night. The kids who are 15 and 16 years old, those who are being used by gang members who are over 18 to carry out some of the crimes like carjacking and car theft, because they won't get the same penalties if they get caught, they don't get put into the FBI crime numbers in the same way. So I always thought that the D.C. numbers, which were bragging about the crime reduction, that was really not accurate. Now, it's a different question. You federalize it, you move in the troops, and then what happens after 30 days, that's a different debate. But I at least knew that D.C. wasn't a model of crime reduction beforehand.
We're having in the 5 o'clock hour, former Minnesota U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar, and I've talked to him before about this. The political ramifications of this are interesting to me because, again, you don't have to, I think, necessarily endorse the approach taken and the idea, the threats now of we're going to put National Guard members in other cities as well if we deem that the cities are not doing enough to deal with crime. I think there are some dangerous ramifications to that. But for Democrats, this is a sticky wicket, I think, because they have to. To me, they have to thread the needle on this. If they come off too much as resisting the notion that in some areas there are crime issues that people, particularly in tough neighborhoods, are dealing with, I think it ends up potentially hurting the Dems. So I think they need to be very careful where they push back and where they don't in this particular area. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. Look at when they were saying in 2021, 22, there's no inflation. but people felt there was inflation because prices were going up at the supermarket and everything else. You can't tell people something's not happening if they don't feel that. And in Washington and other cities, people don't feel safe. The polls have showed that time and time again. And even, people who are strongly for the Democratic Party, like Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe and others, have talked about that. If people don't feel safe, if that's the perception on the street in neighborhood after neighborhood, no matter what you tell them about the statistics, that doesn't really have much impact. It depends on how people's lives and how they feel about it.
I appreciate the time, especially on short notice, and we'll be waiting. Can you tell us what's dropping next or not? What are you working on these days?
I'm actually working on something about marijuana should be changed from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The spoiler is yes, but don't legalize it for recreational purposes. So that's what I'd like to see the feds do. We can talk about that another time.
We indeed will. Thanks again for the help. We appreciate you, as always.
Thanks.
Gerald Posner, best-selling author, investigative reporter, and like I said, these days, with his Substack column, he's breaking news, as he did getting ahead of the New York Times and even CNN regarding this IRS implosion. Gerald, I think, is a big follow-the-story guy, no matter who it ends up hurting politically. That's why we respect having him so much on this program. Top of the hour break. Sometime later in the 4, we'll be joined by Kevin Seifert. We will return to the safety of the toy department.